The lights grow brighter as the earth lurches away from the sun, and now the orchestra is playing yellow cocktail music, and the opera of voices pitches a key higher. Laughter is easier, minute by minute, spilled with prodigality, tipped out at a cheerful word. The groups change more swiftly, swell with new arrivals, dissolve and form in the same breath. Already there are wanderers, confident girls who weave here and there among the stouter and more stable, become for a sharp, joyous moment the center of a group, and then excited with triumph, glide on through the sea change of faces and voices and color under the constantly changing light. Suddenly, one of these gypsies in trembling opal seizes a cocktail out of the air, dumps it down for courage, and moving her hands like Frisco, dances out alone on the canvas platform. A momentary hush. The orchestra leader varies his rhythm obligingly for her, and there is a burst of chatter as the erroneous news goes around that she is Gilda Gray's understudy from the Follies. The party has begun.
This vivid imagery from F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby encapsulates the opulence and allure of the 1920s, a decade defined by extravagant wealth, carefree indulgence, and a relentless pursuit of pleasure. And speaking of which, welcome back to A Push for All. Let's get this wing-ding started.
Today, we're immersing ourselves in the transformative 1920s. 100 years ago, a decade marked by economic prosperity, technological innovation, and profound cultural shifts. So we're going to delve into the rise of consumerism, groundbreaking technological advancements, and the dynamic interplay of cultural and political forces that redefined American society.
We'll also explore the pivotal events and figures, such as the advent of the jazz singer, the landmark Scopes trial, the administrations of Presidents Warren G. Harding and Calvin Coolidge, and the international implications of the Dawes Plan. These elements were instrumental in shaping the complex tapestry of the decade.
Yes, and happy belated President's Day to you guys.
Well
And speaking of jazz, for the jazz age and the jazz singer, Mr. Hill, can we get some scatting? Can we get like a trumpet solo or something like that?
Something like that?
I feel like I'm in a jazz club.
Yeah, this is perfect. I mean, you set the tone.
Hot mamas.
Our aura is jazz.
And cool daddies.
Speaking of all of those things, the 1920s, often dubbed the Roaring Twenties, were characterized by unprecedented economic growth and a surge in consumerism, or basically buying a bunch of junk you don't really need, and the proliferation of mass production techniques. We can think of Henry Ford's famous assembly line that you'll have to learn about in like second or third grade. And then revolutionized industries when made products like automobiles more accessible to the average American.
Yeah, and Ford's Model T is a prime example, even though he had pretty questionable politics and beliefs.
Yeah, a few problems.
Yeah, let's talk about his cars. They were initially priced at over $800 in 1908, but because of advanced industry and production, actually the cost was brought down to $290 by the 1920s, making car ownership a reality for a lot of middle-class Americans. And Ford's new innovations with automobiles not only transformed transportation, but also reshaped urban planning, leading to the extension and expansion of suburbs and the creation of highways.
Yeah, and I have a good Ford. It's a Model A. So Model A was like the second or third version. My grandpa, he was born in 1923, okay? In, I think it was 1928, his dad brought home a Model A, and my papa was like 5 years old, and he was so excited. He ran on the sideboards. He used to have these big extended sideboards, slipped, and got run over. Went right over his collarbone and missed his head by like an inch. We're an inch away from not having this podcast.
So injuries with Like the shoulders and arms run in the family?
Oh yeah, there's a lot of painful stories there, but we don't want to go down that road.
No, we don't. Is it still in the family? Is the Model A still in the family?
No, I think it was probably trashed about 95 years ago, I would guess.
Bummer. What a pile of wealth you could be sitting on
No,
today.
No
Cool.
kidding.
Okay, so away from my personal stories, the consumer revolution that we just mentioned wasn't just automobiles. The 1920s saw the widespread adoption of radios, refrigerators, washing machines, and even vacuum cleaners, all marketed as essential for modern living. By 1929, nearly 40% of American households owned a radio. And by bringing entertainment and news into the home like never before, Americans suddenly had access to all these new gadgets and products and cool things to buy.
Can you guys imagine sitting around the family radio and hearing those first advertisements?
I'd love to hear one.
Folks, are you tired of scrubbing clothes by hand, wearing out your arms, and wasting hours at the washboard? Well, say goodbye to back-breaking labor and hello to modern convenience with the amazing Auto Wash washing machine, the latest marvel in home technology.
Ding!
With its state-of-the-art electric motor, the Auto Wash cleans your clothes in half the time, leaving them fresh, bright, and good as new. Simply load your laundry, turn the crank, and let Auto Wash do the rest. No more scrubbing, no more sore hands. Just sparkling clean clothes every time.
Why, I used to spend whole day doing laundry, but now with the Auto Wash, I have time for bridge club and an afternoon at the soda fountain.
That's right, ladies and gentlemen. Think of the joy on your wife's face when she receives the gift of modern convenience. Why, she'll be the happiest woman on the block.
Ka-ching! Wow, that was unbelievable. I feel like I need one of these machines.
We really sold it. It was very difficult for me to keep a straight face during both Mr. Hill's voice and my own voice. But how did people afford all of these new gadgets? I mean, these things, it's new technology. They sound expensive, but for the first time, Americans had access to credit and installment plans. And Americans could buy now and pay later, which fuels this surge in consumer debt. So department stores and manufacturers, they were only encouraging of this trend to get more customers through their doors. So 75% of cars and 60% of furniture was purchased on credit by the end of the decade.
Right, and you have to remember there's no regulation at this point. You could do whatever you wanted. It was a wild, wild west in terms of credit. And then if you look politically, the government took a hands-off approach, embracing this laissez-faire capitalism. You had Presidents Warren G. Harding and Calvin Coolidge. They championed this business-friendly deregulation policies that lowered taxes and kind of made it easier for businesses to do whatever it took to get those consumers to keep buying all that stuff. I mean, Harding's campaign slogan was the famous, quote, return to normalcy, which reflected his desire to distance America from World War I and all those pesky progressive reforms.
Unfortunately, Harding's presidency was more of a return to scandal than a return to normalcy. Most notably, the Teapot Dome Scandal of the 1920s, where his administration illegally leased government oil reserves in Wyoming to private companies in exchange for bribes. So Harding dies in 1923, leaving his vice president, Calvin Coolidge, to take over, doubling down on Harding's pro-business policies and famously declaring the chief business of the American people is business.
The economic boom wasn't the only defining aspect of the 1920s. The decade also saw a cultural explosion, particularly in music and film. Jazz, which originated in African American communities in New Orleans, became the defining sound of the era.
Yeah, and critics were very divided about jazz. Some hailed it as a uniquely American art form, while others saw it as very chaotic, immoral, unethical. One 1921 New York Times editorial warned that jazz, quote, stimulates the nervous system and excites the senses, leading to moral decay. But for many, jazz symbolized modernity, rebellion, and racial integration.
Exactly. So public discourse at the time connected jazz with, get this, insanity, drug addiction,
Right.
the primitive and bestial,
Ooh.
criminality, infectious disease, the infantile, and the chaotic.
Oof.
This
Sign
is
me
what
up.
society's fearful reaction boiled down to is chaos, because we all know jazz is improvisation, it's unexpected, and it is not structured. So as music historian Ted Goya says, looking back at the first century of jazz's music, its most identifiable trademark may simply be this unwillingness to sit still, this mandate to absorb other sounds and influences, this destiny as a music of flux and fusion. In America, music was the first sphere of social interaction in which racial barriers were challenged and overturned. And the challenge went both ways. By the mid 1920s, white bands were playing for all black audiences at Lincoln Theater and elsewhere. These intermediate steps between segregation and integration represented, for all their problems, progress of sorts.
Right. It's really interesting how music is always playing this role of sort of usurping the tradition. And music can be a way to shake things up. We hear jazz today. We don't necessarily think of it as being rebellious, but at the time, it was, as Mr. Hill just said. I mean, it was seen as pure chaos, right? So it's really interesting to think about how music continues to play.
Well, you
this role.
guys are way younger than I am, but I can tell you, as a man of a certain age,
Only physically, not mentally.
well,
as I'm
I'm working on that part.
like 80.
Okay. So I can remember when rap and hip hop kind of exploded onto the stage, and there were so many people who were like, "That's not music.
Yeah.
That's not." And it was chaotic, at least for us at the time, and it's same way people, audiences, mostly white conservative audiences, reacted to rock and roll. They're like, "That's not music. That's noise," and it's that pattern is always there.
Yeah.
I think we saw that with probably people's reaction to Kendrick Lamar's Super Bowl performance. I mean, I
Oh, yeah.
definitely saw comments of people saying that this isn't music and why would you choose this? I thought it was fabulous. I thought like I could never write words like Kendrick Lamar does, but we can make those connections 100 years ago to today.
Yeah.
And it's really more of a cycle of history where an older generation inevitably feels uncomfortable with the new generation's music, but the new generation needs to destroy the past in order to create.
And you guys, that is the epitome of the 20s.
Yeah.
Not just music. It's the traditional way trying to hold on, and it's the modern way crashing up against it.
Exactly. And what's interesting is it wasn't just music. I mean, the musical revolution we just talked about coincided with the transformation in Hollywood. 1927, The Jazz Singer, starring Al Jolson, became the first full-length film with synchronized dialogue, or otherwise known as a talkie, because you could actually hear people talk. This innovation ended the famous silent era and paved the way for the modern film industry.
Yeah, and the thing about The Jazz Singer was that it also highlighted racial tensions of the time because the lead actor, Al Jolson, he was a white actor, performed in blackface, which was a practice rooted in minstrel traditions that perpetuated from racist stereotypes in the 19th century. So while film was groundbreaking in its use of sound, it also reinforced a lot of historic and deep-seated prejudices.
And at the same time, I mean, this is just goes to show how crazy the 20s were. At this very same moment, there was this other cultural battle playing out all the way in Dayton, Tennessee, where the Scopes monkey trial captured all the national attention. In 1925, John T. Scopes, a high school teacher, was prosecuted for teaching evolution and violating a Tennessee law that mandated the teaching of creationism.
Yeah, and just as we were talking about this, the 20s is really symbolic of this clash between modernism and traditionalism. The Scopes trial is a great example of that. It becomes this clash between science and religion, and the defense attorney, Clarence Darrow, squared off against William Jennings Bryan. Of course, we know him from the populist era. He was the populist candidate for the presidency. Unfortunately, he lost. He famously said, "You shall not crucify me upon a cross of gold." He was a staunch fundamentalist, and so he was on the side of, more traditionalism, wanting to maintain religion in what was being taught in schools.
So within the trial itself, Darrow proclaims this in his closing argument. If today You can take a thing like evolution and make it a crime to teach it in public schools. Tomorrow, you can make it a crime to teach it in private schools. And the next year, you can make it a crime to teach it in the hustings or in the church. By the way, hustings, I just found this out. It's like a political, like a election gathering place. Did not know. At the next session, this is Darrow again. At the next session, you may ban books and the newspapers. Soon you may set Catholic against Protestant and Protestant against Protestant and try to foist your own religion upon the minds of men. If you can do one, you can do the other.
And although Scopes was convicted, he was later acquitted on a technicality, but the trial underscores this broader cultural shift that we still see play out in debates over education today. And the trial, I think, at its core is about what should and shouldn't be taught in schools, or what can and can't be taught in schools. And today we still see these debates over book bans, curriculum censorship, regarding topics like race, gender, and history. And some argue that banning certain books protects children, while others see it as an attack on First Amendment freedoms and academic freedoms.
It's interesting that you oftentimes will see people debate and really fight over education during times of transition in history.
Yeah.
And I think that it's not unusual to have people look to schools and to education as a battleground for trying to hold on to the past while other groups are trying to push us forward. And so this tension in schools is something that we've seen in the past, and we're going to continue to see, I would imagine, going forward.
Keep learning from yesterday to make sense of today.
Oh, nice.
Oh my gosh. Where have I heard that before?
Got to trademark that. Okay, so while jazz and the Scope trial were shaking up culture, you also had D.W. Griffith's The Birth of a Nation, which, although it came out in 1915, you really saw how it was going to influence society and public perception in the 1920s. The film glorified the Ku Klux Klan, and it reinforced this racist myth about the past and the Old South, and inspired this resurgence of the Klan as really the good guys riding to the rescue. It reached 4 million members, the Ku Klux Klan, by the 1920s, in large part to mirror the images that Americans saw on the silver screen. Woodrow Wilson even screened it in the White House.
And in response to all of this, this reinforcement of racial stereotypes through things like the jazz singer, and also ideas that persisted through the Birth of a Nation and the rise of the Klan again, the Harlem Renaissance is a movement that starts to flourish as Black intellectuals like Langston Hughes, we brought him up last episode, Zora Neale Hurston, and Elaine Locke use literature, poetry, and music to celebrate African American identity and challenge racism. And Harlem's nightclubs, like the Cotton Club was probably the most famous, and literary saloons became hubs of creativity where these artists could debate their ideas, and thinkers and activists could try to racially uplift themselves and self-express.
Right. And the Harlem Renaissance wasn't just about art. It was this larger cultural movement that reshaped how African Americans saw themselves. And really, it was a demand that the rest of the country see them differently too. It laid the groundwork for later civil rights activism and remains one of the most influential artistic movements in American history. So just really quickly, a quick aside. I held back and didn't make fun of Miss Keltner when she accidentally said saloon rather than a salon. But I think it's important to bring up that the Harlem Renaissance did not primarily take place in saloons, although I'm sure they had some good times.
Don't you think it would be cool, though, to have a literary saloon?
Yeah, that's
like you go read a book and you have a drink.
Yeah. First of all, yeah, I'm just starting something new, a trend. And second of all, it's Friday. Yeah. It's the weekend. And my mind is who knows where.
Yeah, it's Friday.
It's all good.
Friday.
It's all good.
So let's pick back up. While the U.S. was booming domestically, Europe was struggling to recover from World War I. Germany, in particular, faced these crippling reparations under the Treaty of Versailles, and to try to stabilize the situation, the United States introduced the Dawes Plan in 1924.
Yeah, and this plan was brokered, it was engineered by the United States, even though the United States had not joined the League of Nations. It was kind of on its own, but the United States was certainly the most stable nation coming out of World War One because it wasn't actually fought in the United States. So what this plan did is it restructured Germany's debt, who was very much punished after World War One, and it allowed Germany to take out American loans to pay back Britain and France, who then in turn used that money to repay the United States back for all the loans it got from World War One. So it's just like this cycle of international finance that temporarily eased tensions between all of these nations, but made Europe's economy heavily dependent on American investment.
And I always tell students, if you're looking for the antecedents of World War II, it's not very sexy or cool. But one place to look is the Dawes Plan, right? And to look to see where this debt is coming from and how it ultimately shapes foreign policy in the years to come.
Of course, though, hindsight is 20/20.
That's true. That's true. It's just interesting to think about. And you know what? To be fair, for a while, this plan really worked. By 1929, Germany's economy had pretty much recovered for the most part. It was at least stable again, and Europe was back on track. Of course, there's this whole stock market crash.
Whoa.
1929.
Whoa. Let's not give it away.
And before we leave the 20s, it's important to remember that not everyone was living the dream. While Wall Street boomed and urban America reveled in jazz, consumerism, and new technology, working class Americans, particularly industrial workers and farmers, faced serious challenges.
True. For labor unions, the 20s were rough. And during World War I, union membership had soared as the federal government encouraged collective bargaining to maintain wartime production. So essentially making sure that labor movements would not slow down or stop wartime production at all. Because if you pause that, you may not necessarily have victory on the battlefield. But once the war ended, business leaders who were backed by this new pro-government business of Republican presidents from Harding to Coolidge to Hoover launched a really fierce anti-union campaign.
Right. And this was the era of the so-called welfare capitalism, where major companies tried to weaken unions by offering workers higher wages, pension plans, company-sponsored benefits. And they did all of this with sort of the gentle nod or push to get rid of collective bargaining. They argued that, hey, if you're happy and well paid, you don't really need a union. But of course, these benefits were selective and they were mostly targeted towards skilled workers and left out the unskilled laborers.
And then when the workers did try to strike, they faced brutal crackdowns. Take the 1921 West Virginia coal wars. Mine workers, demanding better conditions, literally had to take up arms against company-hired police and federal troops.
Right. And then this all, of course, leads into the Red Scare of 1919 and 1920, which played a huge role in union decline. After the Russian Revolution, many Americans associated union activism with radicalism and even communism. The Palmer raids targeted suspected leftist, anarchist, and labor organizers and further stigmatized unions. By the end of the 1920s, union membership had dropped from 5 million to about 3.5.
That's a big drop. But if workers had it bad, farmers had it worse. During World War I, European agriculture had collapsed, so American farmers ramped up production to feed both the U.S. and war-torn Europe. They borrowed millions of dollars to buy more land and better equipment. But when the war ended, European farms recovered and the demand for U.S. crops plummeted.
And yet, American farmers kept overproducing, which drove prices
Yeah, there you go.
even lower. And by the mid-1920s, wheat and cotton prices had fallen by over 50% because of this fall of demand, and farmers were drowning in their new debt.
And so some in Congress, they see all this, right? They see the crisis, the debt crisis. They tried to help, especially Midwestern Congress people. They tried to push forward the McNary-Hogan bill. They proposed in the mid-1920s, and its goal was to have the government buy up surplus crops, sell them overseas to help stabilize prices. Now, this is very common. I mean, this is the basis of modern American agriculture. But at the time, it was seen as pretty radical. It was an example of farm relief through price supports, and yet, at the time, they basically dismissed it.
And it sounded reasonable, right? Well, President Calvin Coolidge, a pretty conservative guy, didn't think so. He vetoed the bill twice, in 27 and in 28, calling it economic foolishness. His argument? The government had no business interfering in the free market, and he feared it would set a dangerous precedent for other industries to demand federal subsidies.
And meanwhile, farmers were losing their land by the thousands. And at this time, throughout the 20s, it's important to note that over or close to 90% of farms were small farms owned by individual families with less than 200 acres. So farm foreclosures for these families skyrocketed, and many rural farmers felt betrayed by the government. And I think that that kind of can lead us into what maybe next episode will be about. If you
Nice.
think about the failure of these farmers and how that is going to impact the economy.
Nice
What a
teaser.
brilliant segue.
Yeah.
So, what can we learn from the 1920s, 100 years ago? The impact of mass media. Just like the 1920s saw the rise of jazz and film, today we see the power of social media and streaming platforms shaping culture and politics. Second, cultural conflicts still persist. The Scopes trial was about evolution versus creationism, but today we still debate about what should be taught in schools, from climate change to American history. And lastly, economic cycles repeat. The boom of the 1920s was followed by the Great Depression, much like the 2000s housing bubble led to the 2008 financial crisis.
History doesn't repeat itself exactly, but it certainly echoes, or it rhymes, or something like that.
Yeah, well said. That was you
Very
summed
well
that up nicely. Okay, speaking of summarizing, let's take away these key points here. The 1920s were a decade of massive change, so it makes it so fun to teach. It's marked by economic prosperity and consumerism. So you had mass production, credit, laissez-faire policies created this booming stock market. Cultural revolutions, jazz, film, the Harlem Renaissance, all of these things shaped American identity, while the Scopes trial highlighted tensions between tradition and progress. And then finally, global financial entanglements. The Dawes Plan is going to try to stabilize Europe, but economic instability would ultimately lead to the Great Depression.
And for APUSH students, these themes are crucial for understanding continuity and change over time. So think about how these ideas might have appeared earlier in American history and how they're now appearing in the 1920s and how they're also going to appear in the 21st century. So you can see these ideas appear in LEQs, DBQs, and of course, SAQs.
As we begin to wrap up, we would like to thank our sponsors.
Yes, Junior Java, a student-led coffee and tea company with a mission to make education more equitable worldwide. Every purchase helps support kids in need. Fuel your studies and support a great cause. Check out juniorjavacoffee.com to shop and learn more.
Thanks, Junior Java, for keeping us and history brewing.
Also, big thanks to Cats of Family Dentistry, Scrawny Arms Farm, the Healthcare Group for Women, and Right on Ruben Schlansky College Essay Tutoring. As always, we are honored by their support.
Thanks for joining us on A Push for All. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave us a comment. What's that?
They should
I'm just doing some jazz in the background.
they should also leave us 5 stars.
Oh yeah, 5-star reviews. We actually are getting a lot of great 5-star reviews. So if on Apple iTunes or Spotify, keep doing that for us. You can see us on A Push for All. We've got some great pictures and video clips that we post that people find highly amusing.
Yeah, we actually haven't gotten really any direct messages on A Push for All, but seriously, if there's any topics that you guys want us to talk about, any, whether it's an era or it's just a singular person or anything you're interested in, please let us know.
Yeah,
We take requests.
We take requests, and we would really like it if you would share us out to your friends and family, because we are building a following, and we'd like you to be a part of it.
Yes. And until next time, keep learning from yesterday to make sense of today.